She stood in the rain with a wanted poster in her pocket and knocked on a stranger's door. The man who opened it had a rifle pointed at her chest. She looked at the barrel and said, "Your supper is on fire." What happened next changed both of them forever. A woman running from a powerful man who wanted her silenced. A cowboy who had been slowly dying of loneliness for 4 years, and one October night that neither of them was prepared for. This channel tells the stories that live in the spaces between survival and love, cowboys and widows, loyalty and second chances. The quiet courage it takes to stay when leaving would be so much easier. Because here is what this story taught me. The bravest thing a person can do is let someone see them in the dark and choose not to run. If that sounds like a story worth hearing, stay with us. Subscribe so you never miss one. Leave a comment and tell us where in the world you are listening from tonight. And if this story finds someone who needed it, share it. That is how these stories travel.
I stood at that door for 4 full minutes before I knocked. I know because I counted. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, all the way to 240. Standing in the October rain with mud on my boots and a wanted poster with my face on it folded inside my coat pocket. The paper was soft from being handled too many times. I had a habit of touching it when I was afraid, the way some women touch a locket or a cross, my reminder of exactly how much trouble I was in. The woman at the boarding house in Albuquerque had told me about this place. She had described the man who lived here in terms that were not precisely encouraging. Rough, she said, closed off, hadn't willingly spoken to a stranger in years, kept to himself on that ranch like a man who had decided the world outside the fence line was no longer his concern. But she had also said this: he was the former best field detective the Pinkerton National Detective Agency had ever put in the field. She said he had a code, the kind a man keeps even when it costs him something. And she said that whatever else he was, he would not hand a woman over to men who meant her harm. I decided that was enough. I knocked. The door opened. A man stood there with a rifle leveled at the center of my chest and the coldest gray eyes I had ever seen in my life. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had been weathered by years of outdoor work into something that was not quite handsome, but was entirely impossible to look away from. He looked at me the way you look at something unexpected that you have not yet determined is a problem. Behind him I could smell something burning. "Your supper is on fire," I said. He did not lower the rifle. But something moved through those gray eyes. Not warmth, not yet. Something more like recalculation. "Who are you?" he said. It was not quite a question. "Someone who can cook," I said, "which is more than you can say for yourself at the moment." From somewhere in the dark barn behind me, a voice said, "Jesse, the woman is soaked through. Let her in or I will." The man in the doorway, Jesse, looked at me for another long moment. Then he stepped aside. That was how it started. The kitchen was a disaster. Not a dramatic disaster, not the kind that comes from violence or accident, the quiet, grinding kind that happens when a person has stopped caring enough to pay attention. Burned skillets stacked in the dry sink. Flour gone stiff in an uncovered bin. Half a side of salt pork going questionable on the counter. The stove was good, heavy cast iron, the kind built to last a century. And someone had clearly spent real money on this kitchen once. The evidence was in the bones of the room. But the bones were the only good thing left. I tied on my coat and got to work. The older man who had spoken from the barn came in stamping mud from his boots. He was perhaps 67, lean and weathered, with a bad limp on his left side, and eyes that were considerably sharper than his unhurried manner suggested. He introduced himself as Thomas Calloway, Jesse's uncle. Everyone called him Old Tom. He sat down at the kitchen table and watched me work with the uncomplicated appreciation of a man who has been eating bad food for a long time. "You have skill," he said, after I had salvaged the salt pork, found dried beans and cornmeal, and located a single onion that was still good. "I have practice," I said. "Where does he keep the salt?" "Third shelf behind the coffee tin. He hides it there because he forgets where he put it otherwise. I found the salt. How long has the kitchen been like this?" Old Tom was quiet for a moment. 4 years, he said, give or take. I did not ask what happened 4 years ago. I had enough of my own 4 years ago to carry without borrowing someone else's. Jesse Calloway came back inside when the food was nearly ready. He had put the rifle away. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the transformed state of his stove and counters with an expression I could not fully read. Something between thrown off balance and actively resistant to being thrown off balance. A man who has organized his life carefully around not being surprised, being surprised. He sat down. He ate everything on his plate without speaking. Old Tom asked if there was more. There was. He ate that too. After supper, Old Tom showed me to the spare room at the end of the upstairs hall. It was small and plain, with a window that faced the canyon. A bed, a washstand, a hook on the wall. Everything a person needed and nothing extra. He will not say so, Old Tom told me at the door, but he is glad you are here. He does not know it yet, but he will. I thanked him and closed the door. I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the ranch settle into night around me. The rain had softened to a mist. The window showed a sky beginning to clear, stars appearing one at a time through the breaking clouds. I had not felt safe enough to notice stars in 4 months. I told myself it was just the roof and the locked door. The simple animal relief of being inside and dry and fed. I told myself it had nothing to do with the man who had asked me nothing, demanded nothing, and eaten his supper in silence like a man remembering what it felt like to have someone else in the kitchen. I was not entirely convincing. Some time past midnight, I woke to silence and lay there listening. Then I heard it, or thought I did. The quiet creak of the porch boards outside, the specific sound of someone sitting down in the cold and deciding to stay there. I went to the window. In the dark below, just visible, Jesse Calloway sat on the porch steps with his back to the house. Not pacing, not watching the road, just sitting the way a man sits when he does not want to be inside with whatever is waiting for him there. After a while, faintly, I thought I heard him speak. Just a few words, too low to carry. Not to me, not to anyone who could answer. I went back to bed and lay in the dark, thinking about 4 years and locked rooms, and the specific loneliness of people who have decided they do not deserve better than what they have. I thought about it for a long time before I slept. He was already up when I came downstairs at first light, or rather I thought he was already up. Looking at him in the gray early morning, still in yesterday's clothes, I understood he had not been to bed at all. He was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and a look on his face like a man who had been having an argument with himself all night and had not yet decided who won. He looked up when I came in, said nothing. I went to the stove, checked the firebox, added wood, found the coffee pot, started fresh. "You do not have to do that," he said. "I know," I said. "I want to. I am also going to make breakfast. You look like a man who has not eaten a proper meal in longer than last night." He watched me move around his kitchen with the expression of someone watching a weather system develop over the canyon, uncertain of the outcome, not yet running for cover. When breakfast was on the table, he sat down across from me and we came to our arrangement. He would give me 2 weeks. I would cook and help with the house. He would ask no questions about why I was here or where I had come from, and he would tell no one I was on his property. In return, I would make no demands on him beyond common courtesy, and I would leave at the end of the 2 weeks without argument. "Agreed," I said. Then I set down my coffee cup. "I have conditions of my own." He looked at me. 3 meals a day, I said, "all of them eaten. You do not throw food out, and you do not skip breakfast because you were up all night on the porch arguing with yourself. And when I speak to you directly, you answer in full sentences. Grunting is not communication. I have been married. I know the difference." A silence that lasted approximately 5 seconds. 2 weeks, he said. Then you move on." "Agreed," I said again. "I meant it when I said it. I want to be honest about that." I fully intended to leave at the end of 2 weeks. I was not planning anything beyond survival, beyond putting enough distance between myself and Denver to find somewhere safe to send the evidence I was carrying. 2 weeks of safety was more than I had managed in 4 months. It felt like wealth. I did not know yet what Broken Ridge was going to do to my intentions. Old Tom found me reorganizing the pantry that afternoon. He leaned in the doorway with his bad leg extended and watched me work with the same uncomplicated approval as the night before. I had pulled everything out and was taking inventory before putting it back in a logical order, something that had clearly never happened in this kitchen's recent history. "He used to be different," Old Tom said after a while. "Before. I kept working. You do not have to tell me. I know I do not have to." He shifted his weight off the bad leg. He was the kind of man a room felt different with him in it. Good different. People trusted him without knowing why. He laughed easily. A pause. "He will be that again. He just needs proof that it is worth the trouble of being." I turned to look at him. What happened 4 years ago? Old Tom considered me for a moment, decided something. He lost his partner, a man named Robert Dean. They worked together for 7 years. Jesse planned an operation. Good plan, solid by every measure. There was an ambush no one could have predicted. Robert was killed. He looked at the floor. The investigation cleared Jesse completely. Jesse never cleared himself. I turned back to the pantry. And he quit. Came back here. Hasn't left the property for anything but supplies since. I thought about that while I arranged tins in alphabetical order by contents. "He is punishing himself," I said, "by living small." "Yes," Old Tom said, "that is exactly right." He was quiet for a moment. Then, almost as an aside, so casual I almost missed it. "You ever think about having land of your own, Clara? Not working someone else's kitchen. Your own place, your own ground." I looked at him. The question was so unexpected it took me a moment to find an answer. "People like me do not end up with land, Mr. Calloway." "People like you," he said slowly, "are exactly who ends up with it. The ones who earn it the hard way." He pushed off the door frame. "Something to think about." He went back to his chair in the sitting room. I stood in the pantry with a tin of preserved peaches in my hand and thought about it, without understanding yet what he was actually telling me. Late afternoon. I was at the kitchen window watching the light change on the canyon walls when I saw the rider. He appeared at the tree line at the far western edge of the property, maybe a quarter-mile out. He sat there on a dark horse, still and patient, watching the ranch house with the particular stillness of someone who was trying to look like he was not watching. He stayed for perhaps 2 minutes. Then he turned and rode back into the trees. Too far to see his face. Too deliberate in his stillness to be a passing traveler. I dried my hands on my apron. I said nothing to Jesse or Old Tom. But that night, I checked that the spare room door had a solid lock, and I moved my canvas bag from under the bed to inside the mattress, the journal tucked against the springs where no casual search would find it. The journal with my grandmother's recipes on one side and Harrison Cole's crimes on the other. Old habits from a marriage that had taught me to be careful with the things that mattered. On the 4th morning, I found the locked room. It was at the end of the upstairs hall, past the linen cupboard, past Old Tom's room with its always open door. An ordinary door, painted the same shade as the others, except for the padlock on the hasp. New padlock on an old hasp. Someone had added it deliberately, recently, meaning within the last few years. I did not touch it. I stood in the hall and looked at it for a moment, and then I went downstairs. Old Tom was at the table. "Robert Dean's room," he said before I could ask. "Jesse locked it after, never went back in. Keys on his ring." I poured coffee. "How often did Robert stay here?" "Often enough that he had his own room." Old Tom wrapped both hands around his cup. They were close in the way that men who trust each other with their lives get close. "Jesse does not have many people. When he has one, he keeps them." He looked at the table, or he tries to. I thought about that locked door for the rest of the morning. I thought about what it meant to keep someone by preserving the space they occupied. Whether it was love or grief, or just the specific paralysis of a man who did not know what else to do with a room, I understood it more than I wanted to. The fence repair happened on the 5th day. Jesse had been out on the east pasture since before I was up, working the section where 3 posts had rotted through and the wire had gone slack. I knew because old Tom mentioned at breakfast that Jesse had skipped the meal entirely, which violated our agreement, which I took personally. I packed lunch in a cloth and walked out to find him. He was on his knees in the dirt with pliers and a new reel of wire, sleeves rolled up, working with the focused efficiency of a man who knows exactly what he is doing and is entirely occupied by doing it. The gash on his right forearm had been bleeding for a while, long enough to dry to brown at the edges and still run red at the center, and he had ignored it completely. "You are bleeding," I said. He looked up, then down at his arm. "It is fine. It is not fine. It is a wire cut and it needs to be cleaned." I set the lunch down on a fence post and opened the cloth I had brought specifically because old Tom had mentioned Jesse's habit of injuring himself and ignoring it. I cleaned and bandaged the cut with water from my canteen and a strip of cotton I had thought to bring. Jesse sat on the fence post and let me work without protest. He went very still in the way I was beginning to understand was specific to him, not tense but quiet all the way through, like a man surprised by something that does not hurt and uncertain how to account for it. When I tied off the bandage, I realized we had not spoken in 5 minutes, and my hands were still holding his. I set his hand down carefully on his knee. "You should eat," I said. "Yeah," he said. He ate. All of it, while I sat on the ground with my back against the fence post and watched the canyon hawks circle in the afternoon updraft. We did not speak, but it was not the difficult silence of the first days. It was something else, something that had less friction in it. On the walk back, he said, "You are a good cook." "I know," I said. Something at the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but in the neighborhood of one. That evening, I made the mistake of trying to teach him. It was a simple thing. I was showing him how to hold a knife correctly for rough chopping, because I had watched him nearly take off his own thumb twice, and I could not stand by in good conscience. I took his hand and repositioned his grip on the handle, and then guided his fingers over the blade with mine to show the correct angle. The kitchen was quiet. The fire in the stove had burned down to coals, and the room was warm and golden. I became aware, in the way you become aware of something after it has already been happening for a moment, of the specific silence around us, his hand under mine, the warmth of the kitchen, the fact that neither of us was moving. From the sitting room, old Tom coughed, loudly, with the theatrical timing of a man who coughs for reasons that have nothing to do with his throat. I stepped back and applied myself very seriously to the onion on the cutting board. Jesse looked at the wall. Neither of us mentioned it at supper, or afterward, or the following morning. But I noticed that Jesse started coming in from the fields a few minutes earlier each evening, for no stated reason, arriving in the kitchen at the time when I was generally starting to prepare the meal. I noticed, and said nothing. Some things you let alone. It was past midnight when I came downstairs for water and found what was on the kitchen table. Not a newspaper. A wanted bulletin, the official territorial kind, printed and distributed by the marshal's office. My name at the top, my description in clear black type. The charge: theft of property, flight from lawful authority. A reward figure that made me feel simultaneously important and sick. It was folded open. It had been read. I stood in the dark kitchen holding it, and I heard a sound and looked up. Jesse was in the doorway to the hall. Fully dressed, he had clearly not been to sleep. "Wade Briggs came here 2 days before you did," he said. His voice was quiet and even. "He told me to watch for you. Gave me that bulletin and $50. Said there would be more if I delivered you to him in Dusty Creek." My hands were steady. My voice was steady. I had spent years in a marriage that punished visible fear, and the training holds. "And?" I said. "And I told him I had not seen you and to get off my land." Jesse leaned against the door frame. He looked tired in the way of a man who has been awake making decisions. I did not know then that was true. I know it now. He looked at me for a long moment. "I am not asking you anything tonight," he said, but I think in the morning you might want to tell me what is actually in that bag of yours." He went back upstairs. I sat down at the kitchen table in the dark and pressed my hands flat against the wood to stop them shaking. Not from fear, from something else, something I did not have a clean word for. He had known. He had known before I knocked on that door. And he had turned down $50 and kept my secret from a man he used to work beside. Harrison Cole never did anything without calculating what it would cost him. I had been married to that calculation for 9 years, and I knew its shape intimately. This was not that shape. This was something I did not have a map for. I sat at that table for a long time, thinking about it. Outside, the October wind moved through the canyon. The stars were very bright through the kitchen window. I had not felt safe enough to notice stars in 4 months. Here was the thing about that. It terrified me more than the wanted bulletin. Because safety was the thing I could not afford to want too much of. And I was already starting to want it with a specificity that had a man's shape in it. A particular man. A man with cold gray eyes in a locked room upstairs and the remnants of someone good buried under 4 years of intentional smallness. That was the most dangerous thing that had happened to me yet. And I had been running from a wanted poster for 4 months. Morning. I was packed before Jesse came down. Not from fear of him, from the habit of it, the muscle memory of 4 months where staying too long in one place meant getting caught. I had the canvas bag on my shoulder and a note of thanks written on the back of a flour sack scrap, and I was at the door. Jesse came down the stairs and moved to block it, not aggressively, not threateningly. The way a wall is firm, simply by being there. "You have not eaten," he said. "I should go. You should eat first." He looked at the bag on my shoulder. "Then we can talk about the rest." Old Tom had the coffee ready. He set 3 cups on the table and went to see about the horses with the tact of a man who understood when a room needed to be smaller. Jesse asked me one question. "Did you take his money?" I looked at him straight across the table. "No. I took his records. There is a difference. Legally, not much. Morally, everything." "Tell me," he said. So I did, all of it. Harrison Cole, Denver's most respected land merchant and speculator, a man whose name appeared on civic buildings and charitable endowments and the guest lists of every important dinner in the territory. The dinner parties where senators ate and judges relaxed, and territorial officials signed their names to things. The food, my food, that was never only food. The physician Cole kept on private retainer who provided what he called settlement compounds, substances that made men agreeable and forgetful and unlikely to remember clearly what they had agreed to over a fine meal. I had not known. I want to be clear about that. I cooked for those dinners for 3 years, and I did not know what I was carrying until one evening in February, when I went to Cole's study looking for a recipe book I had left there and found the physician's private ledger left open on the wrong desk. An accident, I think. A moment of carelessness from a careful man. The ledger had everything: names, dates, compounds administered, contracts executed, amounts paid to various officials to look the other way on various matters. And at the back, a separate section. Records of employees who had become problems. A cook named Dorothy Ames, who had worked Cole's kitchen before me. Notation of her complaints, her attempts to leave, the date she was found in the Platte River. Ruled accidental. No investigation. The notation after Dorothy's name read, "Resolved." I had understood, reading that word in Cole's precise handwriting, that I was looking at my own future. That I was reading the record of what happened to women who knew too much and had no one powerful enough to ask questions on their behalf. I closed the ledger. I took it. I left that night. Jesse listened to all of it without interrupting. His hands on the table were very still. His face gave almost nothing away. Almost. When I finished, he said, "Where is the ledger now?" I reached into my bag and set the journal on the table, small, worn. My grandmother's handwriting on the front cover. Jesse did not touch it. He looked at it for a long moment. "Cole sent Briggs to get it back," he said. "Cole sent Briggs, mate," I said, "because he wants me where I cannot speak to anyone who matters. The ledger is proof. I am the witness. He needs both gone." Jesse was quiet. Then, "What did he say to you the last time you saw him?" I told him. The exact words, because I had not been able to forget them. Cole, standing in the doorway of his study, looking at me with that particular expression I now understood as the one he wore when he was explaining consequences. "You are the most valuable thing I own, Clara. Not because I love you. Because you have a gift I require. A woman with a gift and no powerful family is manageable." He had smiled when he said it, the same smile he wore at dinner parties. I had understood in that moment that I had never been a wife. I had been an instrument, a very fine instrument, well maintained, that he had decided to replace rather than repair. Jesse looked at the journal on the table. He looked at me. Something moved through those gray eyes that I did not yet have a name for. "Briggs knows this property," he said. He stood and went to the window. "We worked 3 years together. He knows the approaches, the sight lines, where the weak points are." A pause. "He is not coming back alone." Old Tom appeared in the doorway. He looked between us. "You just decided to involve yourself in someone else's trouble," he said to Jesse. "First time in 4 years. Jesse did not answer. But he did not leave the window either. Jesse rode into Dusty Creek the next morning. I stayed at Broken Ridge. I knew what my face looked like on a wanted bulletin, and a town was the worst possible place for me. I spent the morning in the kitchen garden, which had gone to weeds and ruin, pulling the dead growth back to see what, if anything, was still alive underneath. There were onions, some stubborn sage, a sprawling volunteer tomato vine that had no business surviving October but had managed it through sheer stubbornness. I understood the tomato vine. I kept it. Jesse came back in the late afternoon. He unsaddled his horse in the barn and came to the kitchen door and stood there for a moment before he came in, the way a man stands when he is deciding how to say something. "Briggs has been in town 3 days," he said, "showing your bulletin to anyone who will look at it. He has spoken to Sheriff Aldridge. He has offered money for information about Broken Ridge. I kept my hands busy with the supper. Has anyone taken it?" "Not yet." He sat down at the table. "Martha Greer at the boarding house pulled me aside. She wanted to know if I believed you were what the bulletin said you were." "What did you tell her?" "No," he said. I set a plate in front of him. "What did she say to that?" "She said, then we will do what we can." He looked at the food. "Martha Greer has outlived 2 husbands and a cattle epidemic. She is not a woman who makes statements she does not mean." I sat down across from him. "And the sheriff." Jesse picked up his fork. "Aldridge is an honest man, which means he can be used against the wrong people by anyone with the right paperwork. He told me he cannot ignore a legal warrant if a formal complaint is filed. He was telling me as a courtesy. He is troubled by it." I thought about that while we ate. "There is something else," Jesse said. "Martha told me something about a woman who worked for Cole before you. Dorothy Ames." "She drowned in the Platte River," I said. "Ruled accidental." Jesse looked at me. "Martha had a woman staying at the boarding house last spring, passing through from Denver. She had worked for a wealthy merchant, would not say the name. But she told Martha there had been a woman before her who tried to leave and ended up dead. She had tried to leave once herself and been brought back." He set down his fork. "I do not think Briggs is here to arrest you, Clara. I think the warrant is cover for something else." The kitchen was very quiet. "I know," I said. We looked at each other across the table I had known since February. Since I read the word resolved in Harrison Cole's handwriting and understood what managed meant when a man like Cole applied it to a person. After supper, I passed the study on my way upstairs and saw the light still on under the door. Old Tom was at the writing desk, a pen in his hand and papers spread before him. He heard me pass and looked up. He turned the papers over with a deliberate, unhurried motion and wished me good night. The desk drawer closed as I went up the stairs. I heard the small, distinct click of the lock. It was late, after the dishes, the kitchen cleaned, and the fire banked. Jessie was still at the table. I had poured second coffees for both of us without thinking about it, and he had taken the cup without comment, which had become its own kind of conversation. I said, "Thank you for not giving me to him. When Briggs came with the $50, you did not have to make that choice." Jessie looked at his coffee cup. "Yes, I did," he said, quiet and certain. It was not a real choice. I looked at him. He was going to say something else. I could see it in the set of his shoulders, the way a man looks when words are coming up from somewhere they have been stored a long time. He opened his mouth. A horse screamed in the pasture. Both of us were at the window in 2 seconds. A coyote at the fence line. A spooked mare kicking up dust in the moonlight. Jessie went out to settle her. I stood at the window and watched him cross the yard and thought about the look on his face in the moment before the horse screamed. When he came back in, I said the food was still warm, and he said thank you, and we ate the rest of the meal in a silence that had something unfinished living in it. Neither of us named it, but it was there. Briggs came that night. A knock at the ranch door after dark. Jessie answered it with me at the top of the stairs, out of sight, listening. Briggs's voice was professionally pleasant. A lawman's voice, practiced at being reasonable while communicating that reasonableness was a choice, not an obligation. "I know she is here, Calloway. I have known since Tuesday. I would rather do this the easy way. We both would." "The warrant is built on fabricated information," Jessie said. "I am not honoring it." "That is not your determination to make." "I just made it." A pause. "I will come back with Sheriff Aldridge and enough men that you do not have a choice. Get some sleep." The sound of boots on porch boards, hooves on the packed dirt of the yard moving away. Jessie closed the door. He stood with his hand on it for a moment. Then he turned and looked up the stairs at me. I was sitting on the top step. We looked at each other in the quiet of the house. "All right," he said, not to himself, to me. "All right," I said back. It was not a plan, it was not a promise. It was 2 people on either end of a staircase deciding without saying so directly that they were in this together. That was enough. For that night it was enough. 2 days passed. They were quiet days which made them worse in their way. The quiet before something is its own kind of pressure. I cooked. Jessie worked the ranch. Old Tom read in his chair by the window and watched us both with the patience of a man who has learned that some things cannot be rushed. Briggs did not return. No riders appeared at the tree line. The canyon was golden and still in the October light, and if I had not known what was coming, I might have thought we were simply 3 people living quietly on a ranch at the edge of the territory, which was all I had ever wanted, and none of what I was going to get. Despair, Peak 1. The second night, after Jessie and Old Tom had gone to bed, I sat down on the kitchen floor with my back against the warm iron of the stove, and I let it come. I had been holding it down for 4 months. The specific effort of that, the daily work of keeping fear functional rather than paralyzing, takes a toll that you do not feel until the moment you stop. And something about the kitchen at Broken Ridge, the warmth of it, the smell of wood smoke and the food I had cooked, the window with the stars visible through it. Something about this particular safety in this particular place made it impossible to keep holding. So I stopped holding. I cried in the way you cry when you have been practicing not crying for a very long time, badly, completely, with no dignity whatsoever. I cried because I was tired, because I had been afraid every day for 4 months, and I was so tired of being afraid. Because I had let myself, stupidly, recklessly, start to want to stay in this kitchen, in this house, in this particular place with these particular people. I knew better. Wanting things was how you lost them. I had learned that lesson thoroughly and early, and I had let myself forget it, and now I was sitting on a kitchen floor at midnight paying for it. Clara. I looked up. Jesse was in the kitchen doorway. He was in yesterday's clothes, which meant he had not been to bed either. He looked at me the way a man looks at something he was not prepared for and is trying to determine the correct response to. "Do not," I said. My voice was a wreck. "Do not be kind right now. I cannot manage kind." He crossed the kitchen. He sat down on the floor beside me, back against the stove, close enough that his shoulder was near mine. He did not touch me. He did not speak immediately. Then he said, "I'm going to tell you something I have not told anyone." And he told me about Robert Dean, not the facts. The facts were in a Pinkerton file somewhere. He told me the version that lived in him, that Robert was the first person in 30 years who had known Jesse fully and chosen to stay. That the plan that got Robert killed was solid. He had reviewed it 1,000 times. He knew it was solid. The ambush was something no intelligence could have predicted. That none of this mattered in any way that counted, because Robert was dead and Jesse was the one who had said, "Let us take this case," and so Jesse was the one carrying it. "For 4 years," I said, "you have been punishing yourself by living small." He said nothing. Eating burned food and speaking to no one and letting the ranch go to half of what it was. I looked at him in the firelight, as if suffering quietly is the same as being sorry. It is not the same. Suffering does not honor him. Building something would. Jesse was quiet for a long time. "I know," he said finally. "Just that." We sat on the kitchen floor until the fire burned down to coals. Somewhere in that time, his hand moved and covered mine on the wooden floor between us. Neither of us moved it. When the first gray light began at the window, I realized I had been asleep against his shoulder, and he had been awake, sitting there, letting me sleep. Old Tom found us in the morning. He stood in the kitchen doorway, looked at us for a moment, and went back to the sitting room to put the kettle on. I heard him moving around in there, unhurried, not saying anything. He did not need to. Old Tom received a letter by the morning writer. I saw his face when he read it. That is all I needed to see. He folded the letter and put it in his coat pocket and told us it was ranch business, nothing of concern. That evening, while Jesse was in the barn and I was alone in the house, I did something I am not proud of. I went to Tom's coat where it hung by the door, and I found the letter. I read only the last line. "Harrison Cole departed Denver by private rail car Thursday last. Expected Dusty Creek by end of week. He is coming himself." I put the letter back. I went to the kitchen and stood with my hands flat on the counter and breathed carefully. Cole did not travel for business. Cole sent people. He had more people at his disposal than any man I had ever known. People who owed him things. People he owned outright. People who were afraid of him. For Cole to come himself meant one thing. He had decided this needed to end in a way that required his personal attention. He was not coming to bring me back. He was coming to make sure I never had the opportunity to speak to anyone who mattered. Briggs was not an arrest warrant. Briggs was the warning shot. Harrison Cole arrived in Dusty Creek on a Friday. Jesse came back from town that afternoon and told me what he had found. Cole had checked into the best room at the hotel, which in Dusty Creek was not saying much, but Cole made it work. He had introduced himself to Sheriff Aldridge, bought dinner for half the saloon, and told his story with the quiet conviction of a man who has had years of practice making people believe things. His wife, he said, had suffered a mental collapse following a miscarriage, a private tragedy they had kept quiet out of dignity. She had taken money from the household accounts in a confused state and fled before he could get her the help she needed. He had been searching for 4 months, sick with worry. He produced a physician's letter, a photograph of a handsome couple at a civic function, the specific details of a man who has done his research on what grief looks like and reproduced it faithfully. Aldridge was a good man, being expertly worked. Jesse had gone to face Cole directly. Cole had been gracious, pleased to meet a man who had so generously sheltered his troubled wife. And then after the pleasantries, the thing I knew he would say. He had looked at Jesse and said in that quiet voice that never rose and never threatened directly, "I understand you had a difficult end to your career with the Pinkertons. Losing a partner is something a man does not fully recover from. I hope you have not allowed your judgment to be clouded by a woman who is very skilled at appearing in need of protection. Jesse came home and he was closed in a way I had not seen before. You should go, he said. We were in the kitchen. He was not looking at me. Before more people are pulled into this on your account. The words landed the way they were intended to. I felt them. But I had also been married to Harrison Cole's particular brand of manipulation for 9 years, and I knew what it looked like when it had been used on someone. Do you believe that? I said. What you just said. He did not answer. That is my answer, I said. I went to the stove and started supper. After a moment, I heard him sit down at the table. He stayed there through the meal and after, and did not raise the subject again. Old Tom found Jesse in the barn. I did not hear what was said between them. But when Jesse came in later, something in him was different. Not open, exactly, but less barricaded, like a window that has been unlocked, even if it has not been raised. He stood in the kitchen doorway and watched me work for a moment. Then he said, "I'm sorry for what I said earlier." I looked at him over my shoulder. You were scared. Yes. I know why you were scared. I turned back to the stove. Cole is very good at finding what a person is afraid of. It is his particular skill. He did it to me for 9 years. Jesse was quiet for a moment. He mentioned Robert. Of course he did. A long silence. Then Jesse came into the kitchen and sat down, and I poured coffee, and we sat across from each other in the lamplight while the October wind came down from the canyon. He is going to move soon, Jesse said. Men like Cole do not like being in the field. They prefer to direct from a distance. Coming here himself means he wants this finished. I know. We need to be ready. I know that too. I looked at him across the table. Jesse, whatever happens next, I want you to know that these days here have been the first time in 8 months that I have felt like a person instead of a problem to be solved. That matters to me, whatever else happens. He looked at me. That thing was moving in his eyes again. The thing I kept seeing and kept not being able to name. Nothing is going to happen to you, he said. I am going to make sure of that. You cannot promise that. No, he agreed. But I am going to anyway. Outside, the wind moved through the canyon. The lamp flickered. I thought about what it meant to have someone say a thing they could not guarantee and mean it completely anyway. I thought it might be the bravest thing I had heard in a very long time. They came at 3 a.m, not to the house, to the barn. Jesse smelled it first. He was out of bed and down the stairs before I was fully awake, moving with the speed of a man whose instincts run faster than his thoughts. By the time I reached the kitchen window, the east wall of the barn was showing orange through the gaps in the boards. I went out. I know how that sounds. I know the sensible thing was to stay in the house, stay out of sight, let Jesse handle it. But I stood at the kitchen door and watched the smoke thicken against the night sky. And I thought, I have spent 4 months running from one man's cruelty. I am not standing here while a better man burns for it. The barn doors were open. Jesse was inside. I could hear him talking to the horses low and steady. The kind of voice that cuts through animal panic if you keep it calm. I went in after him. The smoke was thick at the ceiling and clear at the floor, so I stayed low. Found Jesse at the far stall with his hand on a mare's halter, getting her turned toward the door. I took the halter of the gelding in the next stall and followed him out. We came out coughing, both of us, stumbling into the yard with the horses pulling against our grips. The barn roof groaned. There was a long, terrible moment when I thought it would hold, and then it did not. It came down in a curtain of sparks and burning timber that lit the whole yard orange and sent the horses screaming. Jesse kept hold of both animals. I do not know how. He had rope burns on both palms afterward that he did not mention for 2 days. When the roof stopped falling, I became aware of someone standing at the edge of the yard. Wade Briggs, 3 men behind him, all of them between us and the house. Jesse was still getting his breath back. The smoke had hit him harder than it had hit me. I stepped forward. Briggs looked at me with something I could not immediately read. not triumph, not quite. "It is over, Mrs. Cole," he said. "Come with me now, and no one else gets hurt." "My name I said, "is Clara Whitfield." My voice was steady. I want to note that because it surprised me, too. Something had burned off in that barn along with the hay and the old timber, some portion of the fear that had been running me for 4 months. I looked at Briggs and I felt, instead of terror, something colder and cleaner, something that had his measure in it. "You have worked for Harrison Cole for 3 years, I said. You know what his ledger says about people who become inconvenient. You know about Dorothy Ames." Briggs said nothing, but his weight shifted. "Cole does not leave loose ends," I said. "He is precise about it. You have seen his records. You know what the notation looks like when a problem has been resolved." I looked at him steadily. "You are a loose end, Wade. The moment this is finished, you are a very significant loose end." The 3 men behind Briggs looked at each other. Briggs looked at me. Martha Greer's voice came from the tree line to the north. "Sheriff is here, Wade." Sheriff Aldridge rode in from the South Trail with 6 deputies, and Martha and 2 ranch hands from the neighboring property who had seen the glow from 3 miles off. Briggs looked at the numbers. He made the calculation. He dropped his weapon. Cole's 3 men scattered into the dark. Cole himself was not there. Cole was never anywhere officially. When the deputies searched Briggs, they found a sealed letter in his inside coat pocket. Aldridge broke the seal. "Read it." His face changed in a way I had not seen on his face before, and Ben Aldridge was not a man given to visible reaction. He handed it to Jesse. It was Cole's handwriting, his personal seal, an authorization written in the careful courtroom-ready language of a man who understood documentation, for the permanent resolution of the Clara Whitfield matter and the elimination of any associated complications. 2 names, Clara Whitfield, Jesse Calloway. Aldridge looked at Briggs. "He was going to have you killed too, Wade. Once the job was finished, you knew too much." Briggs sat down on the ground. He sat down the way a man sits when his legs have decided the argument before his brain has caught up. He looked at the letter in Jesse's hand. "How long?" he said. It was barely a voice. "Long enough to document it," Jesse said. Clara stood in the yard with ash in her hair and the smell of wood smoke on everything she was wearing, and looked at the letter and thought, it was never a warrant. From the first day Briggs rode onto this property, it was never about bringing me back. There was no version of this that ended with me alive. She had known, somewhere under the running and the fear, since February. But seeing it in Cole's handwriting, with his seal on it, with Jesse's name beside hers, made it real in a different way. Jesse folded the letter and handed it to Aldridge. Then he came to where I was standing and looked at me for a moment. "Are you all right?" he said. "I will be," I said. He put his hand on my shoulder. Just briefly. Just long enough. "Good," he said. Briggs talked for 3 hours. He sat in the Dusty Creek jail and gave Aldridge everything. The original warrant for my arrest had been obtained through bribery of a Denver court clerk. The physician's letter Cole had shown the town was forged. The authorization letter was genuine, written 2 weeks before Cole left Denver, meaning the plan to kill us both had been in place before he ever arrived. And Briggs gave them something more. Names of officials Cole had paid. Records of transactions. The location of Cole's private accounts in Denver and Santa Fe. Briggs had been keeping his own records, his own quiet insurance, the way men do when they work for someone they do not fully trust. It was enough. Aldridge sent a rider to the territorial marshal that same morning. The marshal arrived the following day with 4 deputies. Judge Morrison, who had ridden out from Santa Fe on Aldridge's urgent letter, convened a formal hearing in the room above the dry goods store. I testified for 2 hours. I had been preparing those words in my head since February, since the night I stood in Cole's study and read the word resolved, and understood what it meant. I had rehearsed them in every boarding house room and behind every locked door and on every cold morning when I was riding and afraid and alone. Now I said them clearly, in order with the precision of a woman who knows that precision is the only weapon she has that cannot be taken from her. The ledger was entered as evidence. The physician who had supplied Cole's compounds, now facing his own investigation in Denver, had already given a signed statement. Two former business partners of Cole's, men he had enriched and then threatened, came forward in the wake of the arrest authorization letter. The documentation was comprehensive. Cole was arrested at the Dusty Creek Hotel. He had stayed in town, supremely confident. Men who have never faced real consequences develop a particular kind of arrogance about their own invulnerability. It is one of the few reliable flaws in otherwise careful people. When the marshal's deputy came to his room, Cole asked to speak with his attorney in Denver. He was informed his attorney was already in custody. Cole's face did something in that moment. Behind the composure, behind the careful performance of a man who does not panic, something slipped. Just for a second, just long enough. I was standing in the hall outside his room when they brought him out. He saw me. He looked at me for a long moment with an expression I had never seen on his face in 9 years of marriage. Genuine surprise. The specific surprise of a man who has calculated everything and discovered at the last possible moment that he miscounted. I looked back at him and said nothing. They walked him past me and out of the hotel, and I stood in the hall and breathed. All charges against Clara Whitfield were formally voided by judicial order. The warrant was expunged from the territorial record. My name was cleared. I stood outside the courthouse, such as it was in the thin November sunshine, and held the order in both hands and read it 3 times. Jesse stood beside me. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Old Tom found me on the porch of Broken Ridge that afternoon. He sat beside me in the other chair, the one that had been empty since I arrived. He reached into his shirt pocket and set an envelope on the rail between us. "I want you to have that before anything else is said or decided," he told me, "because I did not want it to look like it was contingent on anything. It is not. It is yours regardless of what you decide." I opened the envelope. Inside was a deed of property. 40 acres of the southeast portion of Broken Ridge Ranch, the section with the kitchen garden and the cottonwood trees along the creek that ran in spring. Signed over to Clara Whitfield. Dated 3 weeks ago, the week after I arrived. Witnessed by Martha Greer and Sheriff Ben Aldridge. I read it twice, 3 times. "You did not know me 3 weeks ago," I said. My voice was not entirely steady. "I knew Jesse," Old Tom said. "I have been watching that man for 40 years. I know what he looks like when something matters to him. He had not looked like that since before Robert died." He looked out at the canyon. "I am 67 years old. I have been watching this land for 50 of those years. It needs someone who will stay and build something, not someone passing through." I pressed the back of my hand against my mouth. "You did not even know I was telling the truth," I managed. "No," he agreed. "But Jesse believed you before he had any reason to. And that man has never been wrong about people, not once, even when he has spent years telling himself otherwise." He stood slowly, picked up his hat. "The land is yours, Clara. Whatever else you decide." He went inside. I sat on the porch of Broken Ridge Ranch in the November afternoon with 40 acres of deed in my hands, and the cottonwood trees turning gold along the creek below. And I cried. Properly. Completely. The way you cry when something you stopped believing was possible turns out to be real. It was the first time I had cried from happiness in so long I'd forgotten it felt different from the other kind. It felt like opening a window in a room that had been closed too long, like the first real breath after months of breathing carefully. It felt like the beginning of something. Jesse found me in the kitchen garden the next morning. I was on my knees in the turned earth, working the last of the dead growth back to expose the soil, moving with the specific satisfaction of someone who has been given ground and intends to use it. I heard him come through the gate and did not stop working. "Old Tom showed me the deed," he said. "He told me he would." He did not ask me. No. I sat back on my heels and looked up at him. Does that bother you? Jesse crouched down so we were level with each other. The morning light was coming over the canyon rim, and it caught the gray in his eyes and the lines of his face, all the weather and the years of it, and I thought he was the most honest-looking person I had ever known. Honest in his bones, the way some people are, unable to perform anything they do not mean. I would have done it myself, he said, if I had thought I had the right. I looked at him for a long moment. Jesse, I said. Yeah. You pushed me away. I know. You were wrong. I know that too. He held my gaze. I spent 4 years punishing myself by living small. You said that to me in the kitchen that night. You were right. And then you came here and I tried to keep doing it out of habit, because it was the only way I knew to function, and because I was scared of what happened when I stopped. A pause. I do not want to be scared of that anymore. I pulled off my gardening gloves. Good, I said, because I already planted the herb garden. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not almost a smile this time, an actual one. That evening, after supper, he set something on the table between us. A ring. Small and plain, a narrow gold band worn smooth with years, with a single small stone that caught the lamplight. This was my mother's, he said. She wore it for 31 years. I looked at it, looked at him. I am not easy to live with, Jesse said, with the directness of a man who has decided the truth is the only currency worth spending. I do not talk enough. I will burn things in this kitchen until the day I die. I am better at showing what I mean than saying it, and I always will be. He looked at me steadily. And I am asking you to stay. Not for 2 weeks, not until it is safe. I am asking you to stay and build something here with me on your land and mine, for as long as we both have the good sense to want to. Clara was quiet for a moment. You know I reorganized your entire pantry, she said. I noticed. I will do it again. I figured. And I will argue with you about the east fence line. You would be right to. It is too far east. She reached across the table and picked up the ring. It fit her right hand, which was where she put it, the way women do when they are not yet ready to put it somewhere else, but are not willing to put it down either. Yes, Jesse, she said. I will stay. They were married 6 weeks later, November, on a morning when the first hard cold had turned the cottonwoods along the creek to pure and reckless gold. The ceremony was held in the Dusty Creek Church, which had not seen a wedding in 4 years and showed it, but Martha Greer had arrived the day before with enough determination and beeswax candles to address both problems. The whole town came. The ranchers who had ridden to Broken Ridge in the dark when they saw the barn burning. The deputies who had taken Briggs without hesitation. Martha, who sat in the front row and cried without apology. Sheriff Aldridge, who walked Clara down the aisle because she asked him and he said yes before she finished asking. Old Tom stood at the altar beside Jesse. He was wearing his good coat, and his expression was one of settled, complete satisfaction, the look of a man who planted something in uncertain ground and watched it take root. Judge Morrison performed the ceremony. Do you, Clara Whitfield, take this man to be your husband, to stand beside him in good times and in hardship, for as long as you both shall live? Yes, Clara said before he finished. Morrison looked at her over his spectacles. I have not reached the conditions yet. I have read the conditions, she said. Yes. Jesse's face did something it had not done in public in 4 years. It showed, clearly, and without apology, what he felt. Not performed for anyone. Just there, the way true things are. Yes, he said when his turn came, with the certainty of a man who has thought about very little else for 6 weeks. Morrison said, Then by the authority vested in me by the territory of New Mexico, I now pronounce you husband and wife. And I will add, on a personal note, that it is about time. Everyone laughed. Jessie kissed Clara like she was the only person in the room, which she was to him completely 6 months later. Spring came to Broken Ridge the way spring comes to high desert country. Suddenly, extravagantly, all at once. The creek ran full. The cottonwoods leafed out in a week. Clara's kitchen garden, the 40 acres of southeast range that old Tom had signed over in November, was showing green in every bed. The new barn, built in November with half the county's help, smelled like fresh timber and clean hay. Jesse had carved his initials into one of the support beams, and beside them, without asking, Clara had carved hers. The kitchen at Broken Ridge was larger now. They had knocked out the east wall over the winter and added 2 windows. Morning light came in from 3 directions. It was the kitchen Clara would have built from scratch, if she had been building from scratch, which in a way she had been. She was at the stove on a May morning, humming the way she hummed when she was fully, quietly happy, the kind of happy that does not need to announce itself. Jesse was at the kitchen table with a piece of paper in front of him. Clara had written out the recipe step by step because he had asked to learn this one. He was following it with the focused expression of a man attempting something genuinely difficult and refusing to admit that it was. The smell of burning drifted from the pan. Jesse looked at the pan, looked at the paper, looked at Clara. "How?" he said. "I genuinely do not know," Clara said. She was already moving the pan off the heat, taking it from him, repositioning his hands on the new pan the way she had done in the first week. Her hands over his, the kitchen warm around them, the smell of spring through the open window. "Slower," she said. "Lower heat. Not everything needs to be forced to be right. Some things need time." Jesse looked at her. She was looking at the pan, but she felt his eyes and looked back at him, and they both knew she was not talking about the cooking. She was rarely only talking about the cooking. "Teach me again," he said. "Every day if you need it," she said. Old Tom passed the kitchen window on his way to the barn. He looked in through the glass, the 2 of them at the stove, her hands over his, morning light filling the room, something cooking right this time. He nodded to himself, the nod of a man whose faith has been confirmed, and walked on to his work. People in Dusty Creek tell the story still. The woman who knocked on Jesse Calloway's door in the rain with a wanted poster in her pocket and a ledger full of a powerful man's crimes. The cowboy who turned down $50 and kept her secret before he had any reason to. The fire, the barn, the night the whole town rode out in the dark. Harrison Cole, who is serving 23 years in federal prison in Denver, which is appropriate since Denver is where he built his empire and considered himself untouchable. They tell the story. But Jesse and Clara know the real one. The real one is smaller and more ordinary and more true. It is about a kitchen floor at midnight, and 2 people deciding, without saying so directly, to stop being alone. It is about 40 acres of deed, signed over by an old man who knew something was worth protecting before either of the people involved had said a word about it. It is about a ring worn smooth by 31 years of marriage, passed from one generation to the next, finding the hand it was meant for. It is about what happens when you run out of road and have to stop running and discover that the place where you stopped is where you were trying to get to all along. I came to Broken Ridge with 3 things: a canvas bag, my grandmother's recipe book, a ledger full of another man's crimes. I stayed because of a burned supper and a man who kept my secret before he owed me anything. Because an old man signed 40 acres of hard country over to a woman he did not know on the evidence of what he saw in his nephew's face. Because a town full of people I had never met rode out in the dark to make sure I was still there in the morning. People ask me sometimes, Martha mostly because she cannot help herself, whether I knew that first night that I would stay. I tell her the truth. I knew when Jesse sat down on the kitchen floor beside me at midnight and told me about Robert. Not because it made me love him, though it did. Because it showed me that he had been waiting without knowing he was waiting for someone to sit in the dark with him and choose not to leave. I had spent enough of my life leaving. Home is not a place you find. It is not a place you are given, though sometimes, if you are very lucky, someone gives it to you anyway. It is the decision you make over and over in every ordinary morning. To stay, to put your hands in the earth, to plant something you intend to be there to see grow. I make that decision every morning in a kitchen with 3 windows and morning light coming in from the east. I make it every evening when Jesse comes in from the field and I hear his boots on the porch and the specific weight of his step that I would know anywhere. I made it in a doorway in the rain, with a rifle pointed at my chest and a burned kitchen behind it. I would make it again, every single time. This story exists within the realm of fiction, where imagination shapes reality. Any similarities to real-life individuals, organizations, or events are entirely coincidental. The author does not endorse or represent any real entity through the content of this work.
From the story above, the meaning unfolds not through grand declarations, but through quiet, human choices made in moments of fear, grief, and unexpected connection. At its heart, this is a story about redemption, trust, and the courage it takes to stop running from others and from oneself. The central lesson lies in the transformation of both Clara and Jesse. Clara arrives at Broken Ridge as a woman defined by survival. She has spent months running, carrying not only evidence of a powerful man's crimes, but also the emotional weight of betrayal, manipulation, and fear. Jesse, on the other hand, is a man frozen in time, trapped in guilt over a past tragedy, punishing himself by withdrawing from life. Both characters are, in different ways, imprisoned. Clara by external danger, Jesse by internal remorse. What brings change is not dramatic heroism, but small acts of integrity. Jesse refuses to turn Clara in, even before he knows the truth, simply because it violates his moral code. This decision reflects one of the story's key messages. True character is revealed in choices made when no one is watching, and nothing is guaranteed in return. Jesse acts not for reward, but because it is right. That moral consistency becomes the foundation for everything that follows. Clara's journey teaches a complementary lesson. She begins as someone who trusts no one, shaped by a life where trust was exploited. Yet, over time, she allows herself to believe in something different, not blindly, but thoughtfully. Her courage is not just in exposing Harrison Cole's crimes, but in choosing to stay, to build a life, and to believe she deserves more than survival. The story reminds us that healing requires vulnerability, and that choosing to trust again is one of the bravest acts a person can make. Another important theme is the idea that suffering alone is not the same as redemption. Jesse believes that isolating himself and living a diminished life honors his lost partner. Clara challenges this, showing that true honor comes from continuing to live fully, to build, and to create something meaningful. This reflects a broader moral truth. Guilt and pain are not resolved by withdrawal, but by growth and connection. The role of community also reinforces the story's message. The people of Dusty Creek, who step in to help when it matters most, demonstrate that justice and goodness are not individual efforts alone. When individuals act with integrity, they inspire others to do the same. Together, they create a force stronger than fear or corruption. Ultimately, the story teaches that home is not merely a place, but a choice. It is built through daily acts of care, honesty, and commitment. Clara's final reflection captures this beautifully. Staying, planting, and building, these are the real acts of courage. A person is not defined by their past mistakes or circumstances, but by the choices they make moving forward. Redemption is possible. Trust can be rebuilt, and even in a harsh world, goodness quiet, steady, and persistent can prevail.